Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. Welcome to Building the Bridge. I have the honor of being with Mark Vanderlinden today, a cross-border tax expert with more than 20 years in the US, a lot of those years with the Big Four, some of the Big Four firms, and now out on his own, helping lots of foreign nationals that are moving to the US, or in this case, the topic of today's talk is when they leave. So thank you for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
As you know, we've known each other a long time. I work very hard to get people here legally, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see people leave. But the reality is that that is a growing trend. People do it for personal reasons, they do it for tax reasons, and that's really where you come in, is part of their exit strategy. So can you tell us about some of the tax concerns to keep in mind when planning to leave the United States?
Yes, for sure, Steve. I think the biggest difference that you see there is that when people come into the US, they're taxed from the moment that they arrive in the US. They fall under the US tax system. So the question happens, what happens when they leave? Well, that all depends on your visa status. If you are a green card, if you're a citizen, you have a different outcome than when you are a visa holder. And even if you're a green card holder, if you're less in the US than eight out of the last 15 years, you do not have an exit tax. So this is important. Do you or do you not have the exit tax? If you don't have the exit tax, you can walk away from the US and not be taxed at all. Not be taxed on what? For instance, any shares you own and the value has increased in the US of your investment, any pension that you build up in the US. On the other hand, if you fall under the exit tax, basically what the US tells you to do, the moment you leave the US, we're going to bump everything up to fair market value as if you sold it right now, and you're going to pay tax on that. And after that, you can leave. So you can imagine the difference between leaving tax-free or leaving with an exit tax is significant, especially because you haven't sold your assets. It's a fiction. So now, where do you get the money from to pay the tax if you haven't sold your assets?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you present many times, and the numbers of some of the stories that you've told, and the differences between the planning outcome and the non-planning outcome, or the people who are impulsive and make decisions and sell assets quickly before consulting, it's astronomical. It's almost, it could make or break your economic future, your ability to retire, these simple decisions and the timing of them as well, right?
Yeah, and actually, just to give you a real life example, let's say that you have built up a 401k IRA when you were in the US, right? And let's say that you fall under the exit tax. Well, the exit tax, you're going to pay federal, and if you live in New York, state and city tax on top of that. But also, because you're leaving the US before you're 59 and a half years old, you're going to pay 10% penalty tax. Now, the 10% penalty tax is meant for you not to take money out of your 401k while you're still young. But here, you're kind of forced to take money out because the IRS says, we're going to tax you on the way out, as if you sold everything. So now you're paying 50% tax. So your complete pension that you build up, you lose half of it.
Unbelievable. So what other suggestions would you give people when they're starting to think about leaving? Obviously, number one, don't leave tomorrow without having all your ducks in a row, right? But besides that, because some people sometimes do have to leave quickly, like a foreign national who's sponsored for a visa and the employer shuts down or they decide to let that person go, they have 30 days to leave the US. But in most cases where you do have time, what are some of the suggestions that you give people?
Well, one of the things that we're doing quite a lot is we restructured our pension provision. And actually, when you can then turn your detriment of losing 40 to 50% of your pension provision that you build up into a benefit, because there's a structure that we work that remains you to be taxed in the US. Now, once you leave the US, the only thing you're going to be taxed on in the US is your US source income, and that basically means your pension buildup. So in that case, you may be looking at tax rates of maybe 10% or 5% that you're going to pay over your 401k. So now it's interesting because when you put the money away, you're getting a 30, 40% tax deduction. And when you take it out, you're getting taxed at 5% or 10%, which is a significant difference. And that's just your tax benefit.
Right.
So that's an important one. And another one to know is that people tend to coincide their tax and their immigration and their life as all happening at the same time. So if you leave the US thinking, well, that's where my immigration status ends and that's where my tax status ends. Yeah. And that's not necessarily the case. If you're a green card holder, you can decide when to surrender your green card. You don't have to surrender your green card the moment you leave the US. You can maybe pull it for another 1, maybe 2 years before you surrender your green card. Now, surrendering your green card would be a taxable event. Another thing that you can do if you leave the country with your spouse, you can have your spouse leave and surrender the green card first, and you can surrender your green card a year later. Now you have 2 different tax years. In that period in between, if let's say one person, this is a strategy we use, one person is above the cap that you have an exit tax, or 2 million worth of wealth, right? We can have one person exit with assets that don't trigger a high capital gain tax. So there's no high exit tax out of the US. The other person then can donate assets to the other party within marriage on the US rules up to $160,000 a year. Right. So in 2 years, you can transfer close to $320,000 value to your spouse, who now is no longer taxed because he exited her green card. And maybe that brings you below the 2 million. So now you can exit tax-free. So it's not a singular moment. You can pull it apart. The decision when to give up your green card and therefore end your tax status can be independent from your spouse, independent when you leave. So you can plan it again. It's under your control all of a sudden. Something that taxes, which generally are not under your control, can become under your control and become a planning tool.
I think there's a misnomer in there. Maybe you can debunk this myth that obviously if you have a green card, as you just mentioned, you can plan when you actually formally renounce it, and that will trigger that moment of taxability. But what if you are on a work visa, for example, or a non-immigrant visa, and you leave the US, but you still have assets in the US and you haven't liquidated those? There's still taxability that's involved there, right?
Well, the benefit of leaving the US while on a visa means there's no exit tax. So that's a good thing. They're not going to tax you on the way out.
Right.
But the big question is going to be, what's going to happen with those assets once you 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later sell those assets? And then it depends on the type of assets. If it's a house in the US, the US has the right to tax that house and the gain on that house. If there's share investment, securities, mutual funds, the US generally, under the tax treaties with the country, doesn't have the right to tax you. So it actually depends on the assets you have left. Pensions, for instance, generally retain to be taxed either in the US or they retain to be taxed in the country where you're going to live. So a most important part is that looking at the tax treaty. The US has a number of tax treaties, close to 60. So see the country that you move to, if they have a tax treaty or not. The tax treaty is a compromise between countries where the rules are set. You're better off with a tax treaty on average than when there's no tax treaty, because then you just apply the US domestic rules. And of course, the US will try to tax you wherever you are as long as you are there. And then you have the weird mismatches of, for instance, because tax is also not a singular thing. When you're looking at having securities in the US, the income tax, the capital gain tax you pay on that, and you're not a green card holder, you're not a citizen, you're not taxed on that when you live in another country. However, if you would die, that capital gain tax may be taxed in the US with inheritance tax. And even the strange case that if you are living outside the US, you never lived in the US, but you own US securities and you pass away, there may still be US inheritance tax due, even if you never lived in the US for 1 day of your life. So one tax, the inheritance tax, is different than the income tax. And you have to look at these parameters, how they work for you.
You know, in the law, we would refer to this as long arm, where you have states that are trying to put their arms into other states for things like income tax or sales tax. It sounds like countries are also competing for how much they can extract out of people. So you really have to be on top of not just the laws in terms of tax where you are, but also where you're from and maybe where you're going as well, right?
Sure, and I think it's even worse between countries, right? At least between states. In the end, you're all in the United States of America, so at least you should behave a little bit. You can't really long arm as much as you want. And we see it now in the discussion with COVID, that certain states want to tax you because you work from home, and the other state want to tax you because you ordinarily work in their state. We see that a lot in New York. So 2 states want to tax you on the income. But at least there's some rules about how to do that. When it comes to other countries, it's simple. Either the US taxes or they don't. So they want to tax it. And you can see also that, you know, most times these people are green card holder or visa holders. they can't call any governor or any US government body because you're not a voting person. You don't have a voting right in the US. So there's no recourse in the system for you. It's you against the IRS.
I've always thought about, because my work is exclusively inbound, that pre-immigration planning on a tax level was for the US and people coming, but really you need to pre-plan before you move, each time you move from one country to another, correct?
Yes, and I said this goes from $10,000 to hundreds of dollars of taxes sometimes you can save.
So if somebody wants to save that money, they want to plan ahead no matter where they're going, how do they get in touch with you, Mark?
Well, I think we should do a voluntary session, maybe half an hour to an hour with the people that are interested, where we can actually look at your fact pattern and take an X-ray of your situation and then see what potential benefits there are. I've been doing this for a long time, so I know where the music is and where you shouldn't go. All right, so we can provide my email address and my phone number, and people can reach me there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for all your knowledge and for your time, Mark.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.